I will acknowledge that I was asked to calculate how many students had I taught. I have taught almost 11,000 MIT undergraduates, and my colleague in my department said, great, introduction to computation, 11,000 students. You're responsible for the sorry state of the software industry in Massachusetts. We all know, oops, I'm jumped ahead one. I'm going to be careful touching this button. I think everybody in this room knows that higher education is facing a really interesting and challenging time. We're all here because we're thinking about it. And what I want to do is spend a few minutes telling you about how my institution is debating, discussing, and hopefully implementing changes to education to really think about how we take advantage of the online revolution to teach better. And I want to start with things that I'm sure all of you in the room know, but I want to start with sort of the fundamental question. So, we're roughly a 1,000-year-old industry. Can we change? Should we change? And so, when I say we're a 1,000-year-old industry, the oldest university in the world, University of Bologna, will celebrate its 1,000th anniversary this century. It's about 70 years away. We don't know how they taught when they started, but we have some hints. And so, here's a wonderful picture of a lecture from about 700 years ago. And I want to draw your attention to some elements. You've got some students chatting. You've got some students sleeping. You've got some students checking Facebook. And of course, you've got some students thinking about sex. Let's go ahead several hundred years. How much have we changed? Well, here's a lecture from MIT a few years ago. And what do we have? We have a student electronically chatting, so some progress. We have a student sleeping. We have a student checking Facebook, and we still have students thinking about sex. All right, so now I've got your attention. But what can we think about in terms of, all right, this is how we've always lectured. Should we, in fact, think about changing? Can we think about changing? Do we need to think about changing? And in fact, we can look at some other industries to get a sense of this before we get to the meat of this. Think about other industries in recent days that have faced challenges. What are the things they've worried about? They've worried about their consumer. They've worried about how to make themselves mobile, how to think globally, and especially how to think about unbundling. What does it say for higher education? Well, let's start with our consumers. I would suggest to you, I'm going to use an example of my institution. I'm guessing most of you see the same thing. Our consumers today are different than previous generations. Student comes to MIT today. 10 years ago, they would have likely come to MIT saying, I want to be an X. I want to be a computer scientist. I want to be a mechanical engineer. I want to be an economist. Today, they come to MIT saying, I want to have impact on Y. I want to make an impact on healthcare, on sustainability, on the environment, on pick a topic, which means they're more multidisciplinary, they're less focused on a discipline. And as a consequence, they're also really eager to learn in real-world, often global contexts, something we have not, at least at my institution, done well in the past. They're much more entrepreneurial than they've been in the past. They're more socially aware and engaged. And I would say they are both more mobile and they're more wired. And wired, by the way, is both electronic and caffeinated, but they are more wired than in the past. Our consumers are different. We ought to think about what that says to us as educators as we think about how to engage in that educational process. Those changes are being driven by a lot of factors, and I'm sure they're obvious to you, but I want to highlight a few of them. Information is now accessible, to borrow a phrase from my friend Tanat Agrawal, anywhere, anytime, on any device. Should that change the way we think about how we teach? They form, and I know this worries many of us as parents, they do form communities online as easily as they form them physically. That means they communicate differently, and we need to think about how that affects the way we deal with this. And so, contributing to all of this is the fact that it's not going to go away. The technology is driving this. And I have to admit, this next slide has nothing to do with this talk, but I just like the example. I can't resist showing it to you. And you may have seen these images, right? This image is from 2005, St. Peter's Square. So the event is when John Paul II's body is brought out for public viewing. 2005. 8 years later, St. Peter's Square. This is when Francis comes out to greet the public for the first time. What a change. What an amazing change in what's going on. So that technology is not going away, folks. You know that. We have to think about how it is changing our consumers and changing the way we want to think about how we actually do our education. Now, we've been disrupted in the past. I'm going to get over the history lesson quickly because I'm really a computer scientist, but let's think about it. Big disruption, 1500s. Probably an equally big disruption in 1801, when blackboards were introduced, colored chalk 13 years later. And I think many of us would argue, shows you how quickly we move, we are perhaps in the third big disruption, and we brought it on ourselves. And I put up 3 examples. I will put my own up there as well, but 3 examples where the online digital delivery may well be probably as big a disruption to higher education. We have to think about how we're going to use it. And so what I want to talk to you about is how MIT, and I hope many of you are also doing this, is thinking about how to take advantage of these changes. Why should we disrupt ourselves if we have done it? Well, you know, we like running experiments, but that's not the only reason to do it. We heard this wonderfully yesterday from Nick Dirksen and John Hennessy, but I want to give you, again, a repeat of this. And I can tell you, when MIT launched MITx, there were 3 main reasons. We do want to expand access to qualified, capable learners worldwide that want to take access to it. And we love the stories. If you can't read the image is the wonderful story of the young man in Ulaanbaatar as a high school student who took Anand Agrawal's 6002X, Electronic Circuits and Devices, sophomore level course at MIT and got 100%. And he's a freshman today at MIT, so we love discovering those stories. But for us at MIT, our primary reason was to think about how to reinvent what we do on campus. And I say this because, with no disrespect to the media, the first issue gets all the attention. MOOCs are great, but I'm as interested in SPOCs, small private online courses, as I am in MOOCs. How do we change how we teach our students? And of course, the third one we've heard about, and we just had a great session that I sat in on just beforehand. How do we learn about learning? How do we take advantage of what we can do in these settings to actually think about how we teach better by understanding how people learn? And I want to focus my comments here. I want to tell you about how we're debating, discussing, implementing changes in the way we think about what we're doing to take advantage of these tools to really rethink a residential experience. So here are some of the factors that are really things we have to think about. A lot of industries have already felt this. So what's the digital revolution doing? Well, it certainly, as we all know, has massive scales of adoption. YouTube claims 1 billion unique viewers, 6 billion hours of video watched every month. My favorite example, I get to put these up, although I hate video because it shows that I'm badly out of shape and I'm losing my hair quickly. But several years ago, John Guttag and I took a course we teach, an Introduction to Computation, and we captured it all on video and put it up on OpenCourseWare, which MIT launched about 12 years ago. And my older son pointed out to me an interesting effect, which is the first lecture on YouTube in that course has now been viewed by almost 2 million views, which is a frightening thought. Now, I want to lay the context for you here to show you why there's still some hope. It's going to sound like a strange aside, but I have a cousin who is a retired professional hockey player, NHL player, who was known as Stu the Grim Reaper Grimson. You can go look him up. You're all now on YouTube or Facebook looking him up, but Stu was what's known as an enforcer. So his primary goal in hockey was to engage in fights. And you can go to YouTube and find Stu Grimson's greatest fights. And my older son pointed out to me that Stu's biggest hits, so it's bad pun intended, are about 300,000 videos, or 300,000 views, from which my son concluded that the pen is mightier than the sword. So there's some hope for higher education here. And please don't tell my cousin Stu he's 6'5", 250 pounds, and I'm in deep trouble. Joking aside, we know, we think about this, all of us here, that massive scales of adoption create real disruptive forces for us, even when we're thinking about it on campus. I think a bigger factor, though, is the potential and demand for unbundling. Apple certainly did this with music industry, but it's going to happen to us as well. And yes, if you look quickly, that's my playlist from Spotify when I travel, and you can see I'm very old school in my musical taste. I'm going to move by that quickly. Unbundling is really important as we think about how we teach. I think the third big one, again, we have seen in other industries, but we're feeling on our campuses, is the blurring of the boundaries. You know, what is the difference between a brick and mortar store, an e-commerce site, an auction site? And you can see how those industries have changed dramatically. For those of us who are primarily in brick and mortar institutions, how do we think about what that brick and mortar should look like when these other effects are coming on? And I think the fourth big disruptive one is really very directly addressed to us. And we heard a little bit from a discussion about this yesterday from Nick and John. Affordability and access for students that want to go to college. That's a disruptive force that's going to force us to think about how do we do this better. Okay, so with that in mind, let me pose some questions and give you some thoughts. I want to start with that thing in the headline. I know it's a busy slide, but if learning happens anywhere, anytime, what is or are, I don't know if I'm not an English major, probably should be, what are the roles of both physical and temporal boundaries on campuses? Fundamentally, what's the value added of a residential experience? By the way, I believe very strongly there is one. I'm going to show you an example, but we have to ask, what is the value? What is it a student gains, and how do we use that to enforce that? How much of a degree should be required in a residential setting? Should a degree be completed in 4 years? I'm going to show you some examples of things we've played or thought about rather at MIT in terms of changing that. And you can read the rest of them. The third one I want to highlight, because I'm going to start there, which is basically what's the right, quotes around that, size module for learning? And how do we use that to think about how we teach, and where do we use digital tools versus face-to-face tools in terms of dealing with all of that? You can see the questions. I'm sure you're all thinking about them. So what I want to do is I want to give you a sense of what my institution is thinking about. I've been surprised to discover many of you have actually seen we just released a preliminary draft report of a task force that is looking at all aspects of our education. It's about 140 pages long. I don't suggest you read all of it, but we did want to expose to the world our thinking on this. We will have a final report out sometime later this term, and I want to give you a sense of where we are. And I'm going to talk about four things. I want to start with the first one, sort of the unit of learning. It's a poor phrase, but what's the right size module to use here? And what's the impact it has on a variety of issues? I'm going to butcher this term. I know I've got lots of people here who do this better, but I'm going to use the word module as a self-contained unit that comprises a set of outcomes. And I'm going to use the word outcome, I think perhaps more correctly, as what does a student know or is able to do as a result of that learning experience? And one of the questions we're debating is, and there is no one right size, but how do you think about how to create modules, and what does that do to your curriculum? So I think for us, a module could be anything from a portion of a class to several lectures to a 13-week unit, although I think the latter is much less likely. How do we think about using the modules? What does it make us think about in terms of how we educate? And I'd suggest that thinking about digital delivery very naturally lends you to thinking about how to conceptualize subjects into modules. If you think about an online course, it's very natural to think about the lecture segments and the finger exercises as a combo. So from the MOOC I've taught, across that top bar right there, there's a sequence of videos interspersed with what we used to call 10 years ago finger exercises. I'm sure there's a better term. There isn't a finger exercise or short question to test your knowledge after every module, but there's natural places where you break it to say, this is a good place where I can give the student immediate feedback and I can test their mastery of something I'm trying to deal with. So already thinking about how do I put this together starts you thinking about what are the right size modules. But I think really what's important is what's the impact of those modules on how you think more broadly. And I want to show you a series of very quick examples. I would suggest that this naturally lets you start thinking about more flexible curriculum. So what's a flexible degree? One of our big departments, our second biggest department in fact at MIT, mechanical engineering, about 3 years ago introduced a new degree called 2A. Everything, by the way, at MIT, as I'm sure you know, is done by numbers or letters. So course 2, if you're not an MIT graduate, is mechanical. 2A is a variation on it. But I want to tell you briefly about 2A because it's a fascinating way about thinking about using modularity and then using the online tools. In the 2A degree curriculum, you spend the first and second year still learning the fundamentals of mechanical engineering. Solid mechanics, fluid mechanics, control. In your third and fourth year, you pick 2 or 3 themes, streams, focus points, if you like, concentrations. And those are multidisciplinary. Aha! Just relates back to one of the things we know about our students. They're more interested in a problem than in a discipline. So those things may cut across multiple departments. The second thing mechanical did was I said, if every student needs to know those fundamentals, they may not need them in the same order depending on what streams or concentrations are of interest to them. And so in fact, they have now broken up their curriculum into much smaller sized chunks. And you'll see that right there, that now it's 6-unit courses rather than 12-unit courses. And yes, I know for Stanford, yeah, we're figuring out maybe the quarter system is as good as the semester system. But we're doing it in this nice mix, which is you break up things that naturally break up, and yet other things still extend very nicely. And then just to finish this, the concentration lets students pick where they want to go. And you can see examples of this. What I find fascinating is within 3 years, the 2A degree now has more majors than the traditional Course 2 degree. And I think the modularity helps drive that really nicely. I think a second big place is in flexibility in the pedagogy. Having a focus on modules lets you think about how do I tailor things that fit best in particular settings. When is something best done online? When's something best done with direct interaction? I want to show you a second example. This is a required course at MIT for all undergraduates. It's the second course in physics, electricity and magnetism. It is now being taught on campus, starting this term, in a blended style in which all of the lectures are being offered online using Walter Lewin, if you have seen him as offering the lectures. Students come to class in what we call at MIT Teal-style teaching, which is they come to class to interact in small groups, interspersed with instruction from an instructor, but working on problems in teams. So there's group problem solving. Online assessments are all done using the online system, again with the wonderful immediate feedback. And as we heard this morning, very nicely, the lectures now really become a live textbook. Thank you, Ellen. It's a great phrase for it. And that's the way we're thinking about it. So a course that every MIT student will take is now being done in that way by thinking about the modules and how do we put them together. And the third one, which I'm sure is obvious to you, is that it also naturally leads towards more competency-based assessment. One of the struggles many of us have is that you have a course, you're teaching an upper level course, you say, I need the students to know this. I find another course and I say, you need to have mastered this course as a prereq before you can take my course. A student might get through that earlier course with a C, having learned nothing well, but having enough to be able to get a C. Or worse yet, having learned some things really well and other things terribly, and unfortunately the things they learned really well were not the things that you wanted. Breaking it down into modules more naturally gives you that finer grained way of measuring competency and then using that both to guide students' progress, but also to think about how you want to structure your prereqs. You can now, as an instructor, say, here is the module that you need to have mastered. And oh, by the way, if you didn't master it, here's where you go to get online help to refresh yourself before you come into that. So I hope that the modularity gives us a finer grained way of thinking about how all of the curriculum fits together. And finally, that modularity gives us a great opportunity, I think, to share across disciplines. And I want to just give you one example. John Guttag and I, teach an Introduction to Computation course. It's intended for non-computer science majors, and yes, we do have a few of them at MIT. That usually gets a bigger reaction at MIT. We recently split that course using the things we developed online into 2 modules. The first module talks about computational thinking. It's intended for everybody. The course is now a requirement for about 5 or 6 different departments at MIT. The second portion of the course, the second module, talks about tools, ways of thinking, things that you'd like to use to solve problems. And what we're now leading towards is working with departments so that that second version is personalized for the department. We provide the lectures. But in the recitation sections, the department instructors then take those things and use problems from biological engineering or chemical engineering or aeronautics engineering or mathematics as a specific focus. So you're blending across the institute and leveraging the commonalities, which we think is really valuable. We also think that modules should really let you rebundle things in much better ways. And I'm going to talk about the first one in a second, about how you can use this to blend online with face-to-face contextualization. The second bullet there is really important to me. Excuse me a second. And I wish I could tell you we've done it well, but I worry that we haven't yet at MIT. And I would love to hear suggestions from people about how to do it better. But there has to be a way to use those modules to think about how do you blend in issues of ethics, issues of morals, issues of critical thinking from other modes into technical subjects. We have some early experiments here, and I know I've got some MIT colleagues here, but I don't think we've done this as well as we'd like, but I put it to you. Tell us how to do it better, because I think it's a great opportunity as you think about how to rebundle it. And of course, we can also, as I've already said, connect concepts across concepts and across departments. And one of the nice things that the modularity, I think, gives you is an ability to think about different paths through the curriculum. And so as one example, in my department, EECS, Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, we've built graphs that take the different basic concepts and then automatically chart out connections, so that if you say, if I'm in this course and I'm really interested in this particular topic, where are the modules that most strongly connect to them? If they're in this course, where do I find the access to them? If they're in a different course, how do I find the elements that will let me get to them? And how do I bundle all of those pieces together? It lets the students take a little bit more control over how they want to walk their way through the curriculum. And it lets the instructor think about what are the connections that I may not be thinking about as I use this. Second big topic, what is the role of residential experience? John Hennessy, I think it was John, if it was Nick, I'm going to apologize, said it really well yesterday. I think we all believe this. And I'm going to start with that top quote. It's a quote from me, but it's a quote. I don't know why I put the quote marks around it since I said it, but I put it up there. When an alumnus of MIT worries that by going online with MITx we're devaluing his or her degree, I often say, look, if you really think that all you got out of an education at MIT was acquisition of knowledge, we can solve our budget problem really easily. We take the 2,000 courses we have on OpenCourseWare, take all that material, we hire Steven Spielberg to package it up, and we contract with Phoenix or Kaplan to distribute it, and we just take in royalties. What the hell do we need buildings for? We can rent those out to biotech firms in Cambridge. It's intended to be a sarcastic comment if you couldn't figure that out, right? Because of course, as we all know, the education is as much about those late night debates, arguments, working together in groups. It's about communication, cooperation, leadership, all those nice things. The question is, can we use the online tools to in fact strengthen that? And I firmly believe we can. So, just to give you a sense of the impact at MIT, and then I want to show you some examples. This is data I got just the other day from MITx. We have an average of over 1,000 unique students each day using our online system in some class. Since the spring, as you can see there, of 2013, it's 4,500 unique users. We have about 4,500 undergraduates at MIT. That's spread across 2 years, if you like, so it's probably representing about 80% of our students are using it in at least one class. I'll let you read the comment from a student there, but I think and yeah, I picked a good comment. But it really captures, I think, very strongly the kinds of ways in which students feel about it. The ability to get immediate feedback, the ability to retry things, the ability to move ahead at their own pace on things is really important. So I want to show you a couple of examples of how we're using this. Perhaps the best example is our introductory course to electrical engineering and computer science. It's not a required class, but it's taken by about 80% of all undergraduates at MIT. It has only one lecture a week, but it has both a 1.5-hour software lab, a 3-hour design lab. In those labs, the students work in pairs. The pairs change each week. They try and get a mobile robot to do a range of things, so they learn about circuits, they learn about control, they learn about programming, they learn about AI and planning. The lab is staffed by faculty, graduate TAs, and a large number of experienced undergraduates. And it's all taught in the labs in this mechanism of walking around, Socratically answering questions, pointing students in the right direction. And what we do is, in fact, do all or virtually all of the assessment completely online with immediate feedback and the occasional staff checkoff. We also make extensive use of an online discussion forum, which I'm going to come back to in a second. One of the things we see in this setting is that it's very easy for the students to realize when they do not have mastery of something, and as a consequence know both when to ask a question and how to find the places where they want to use it. What I want to highlight for you is within a year we will go to this format. We will drop the lectures because they've all been captured in small video clips online, and we will simply point the students to them, tell them what they should view before they come to lecture, and we will make all of the interaction in these much smaller settings. This, for us, has been a great experiment and has allowed us both to build, if you like, great assessment tools, but actually move forward really well. People sometimes worry about, well, can you really do the kind of access you'd like? And so I want to point you very quickly to the fact that we now have, and I think, 10 different departments, either virtual or online labs, across a wide range of disciplines. We have it in physics, and there it is, where a student can experiment with a particular problem in electrical charge and get a chance to do the experiment online. We do it in biology, where they can do those wonderful experiments you used to do with fruit flies and they were all over the place, so now you just do it online in biology to understand genetics really well. We do it, excuse me, this is from Anant's class in circuits and devices, and there should be a little sound here, I hope you can hear it. Unfortunately, we may not have the sound. This is basically a student playing with a circuit that is doing some filtering of music as it plays by so they can see the effects of it. So the point is you can do it, as I'm sure you can imagine, in a wide range of things. But notice the list on the side of the different departments that are all doing this. But it turns out you can also do it live. So iLabs is a system in which students remotely access real, very high quality and very unique laboratory experiments to run real experiments. This is in the case of building very sophisticated circuits and semiconductors. So they remotely access an actual lab at MIT and run all of these experiments. That means they can do it when they want to, not when the lab is open. That means that we can worry about maintaining the lab without having to worry about the students. The one thing the students don't get is that wonderful experience you may remember of the smell of something burning when you did it the wrong way. But I'm sure we can add that in somewhere onto an online system so that you can get that olfactory experience as well. Excuse me. The third big piece of this, I know you're all aware of, but the communication. And I think we can do the communication both physically but also online in very effective ways. And I want to highlight for you a place where I think this becomes particularly valuable when you take advantage of the global experience. Harvard did this wonderfully on Harvard X and edX with their copyright course a few years ago, where the course was taught at Harvard Law, but it had a number of global participants, I think restricted, I don't know, where's Rob, I think to 5,000 students if I remember right. 500, thank you Rob, sorry. But the discussion that went on online in that class around copyright was fascinating when you had not just American students, but students from around the world doing that debate. At MIT, we're about to do that with a course on global warming, where we will have, again, a global discussion forum as well as a local one. And I had to say, I wish Carrie Emanuel, who's teaching that class, good luck, because I can't imagine some of the dialogue you're going to get, but you can imagine the experience for our students of listening to a discussion and debate about climate change and global warming from somebody in Central Asia or Central Africa and not just in the central US. Excuse me, sorry. I think a second big place where we're seeing changes is to use the online for focused discussion forums. This is a system called MB by David Karger. Very briefly, it's a PDF system where students can go in and do the equivalent of writing in the margins. They can take a point in the document and write a note saying, why is this, or I don't understand that. It's exposed to the class, and other students can write other comments on it. And the instructor can come in when he or she feels appropriate to insert a pointer, a nudge, a nuance to take the discussion back into the right direction. And it leads to this interesting kind of dynamic that goes on around the discussion forum, both in the classroom and then outside of the classroom. And of course, one that we also heard about is office hours now, anytime, any place. Many courses at MIT have done away with the official office hour. And we use either online discussions, as on MITx or edX, or many of us also use Piazza. It's a great system to have that kind of discussion. Having taught a MOOC multiple times, I can tell you I was terrified about thinking about the discussion with 95,000 students. And one of the things I discovered very quickly was, as somebody said, well, truth is not a democracy, and it's true. Collective intelligence is surprisingly good. You watch the dialogue online, you see stronger students pushing the discussion back into the directions. We have voting systems that let students vote up the questions. It lets a small number of staff interject when they want to. And finally, one of the things we do, which I love, is we, in a course, within 2 or 3 weeks, will identify strong students and say, would you like to be a community TA? Something that Anant created at edX. hey, they can put that on their CV, they think that's great, and they turn out to be really good, and that means when they participate in the online discussion, their voice carries a little bit more weight. So in fact, the dialogue can be really good, and the instructor can always nudge it back where you need to be when it gets a little bit off base. Impact on spaces. I'd like to suggest to you that we're already going through an evolution, right? What's a classroom? Was a room and a blackboard. We have a few faculty who still insist it's a room and a blackboard. We're going to put them in the museum in a few years. I'm sorry. But it's evolved from that, or is evolving from that, to a laptop with a connection, to the cloud and an online forum. And we have to think about, what does that mean for our brick and mortar settings? I'd suggest, and I'm sure it's clear to you, that not only is the classroom evolving, so is teaching, right? Are we orators? I'd love to be Winston Churchill. Or are we educators? So are we really in that sage on a stage, as John said it, or are we really trying to think about how do we better educate by doing more interactive things? And concomitant with that is the change in the assessment materials. One of the reasons MIT moved so strongly towards trying to put the online tools on was our experience, my experience in those big classes is that if I gave out a problem set to a class, they would work diligently on it. If they were lucky, it would be handed back 2 weeks later. And if I was lucky, they would at least look at the grade. But any feedback on what they did or did not understand was completely gone. And so the assessments are changing here. So here's what MIT is now debating. Do we need a 650-seat lecture hall? By the way, it actually looks like that. It hasn't been changed in decades. Is chalk and talk still relevant, or really is it something of the past? These are obvious questions. What is the role of those smaller spaces? MIT is in the process of redoing our campus, and we are very strongly debating whether we should get rid of almost all of these big halls and move towards settings that are much more conducive to those smaller interactions that can be easily reconfigured to a group of 10, a group of 50, a group of 100. Or into spaces that don't really look like classrooms, but have the connectivity and the opportunity for interaction that you'd like. We'll make a decision within the next year or so about how our classrooms are going to look, and I'm expecting that they're going to be very different than what we have traditionally had. We'll probably have 1 or 2 big ones just because we need them for when Mark Zuckerberg shows up. But other than that, what is the role of the teaching mechanism here? This came up yesterday, and I was glad to hear it come up in a question from somebody, because we are really dramatically asking the question, what does a dormitory look like in the future? Picture on the top's from about 10 years ago. The picture on the bottom is a current dorm room of a student. He designed it this way, but it's got an electronics shop in it. As we go through renovating our dormitories, we're asking questions like, what kind of learning spaces or learning conducive spaces should be built into the dorm? Should there be maker spaces in every dormitory, every fraternity, every sorority? How do you do that in a way that does not just encourage the students to simply spend all of their time in their pajamas, sitting in those spaces, and still coming back over to campus? But what does a dorm look like? And if you read the report, you'll see some interesting suggestions. We heard this one as well yesterday. What is the library of the future? And I'd like to suggest that there was a comment made yesterday that they see students still going to the library with their laptops together, working together. And my worry is that they may be doing that simply because it's one of the few places where they can convene. And I'd really like to have a question asked, or answered rather, which is, what should the library look at in terms of supporting learning? Should it be spaces that have places for conversation and interaction? Should they in fact be maker spaces, places where students can try things, as well as holding discussions, as well as quietly studying? And MIT's in the process of rethinking what our libraries look like as well. The last little piece of this is to say, okay, if we're going to do that, how do we change? And one of the things we tried, and we're going to continue to do, is think about what I think people would call an academic village. These are images from the first one MIT built. It was just 2 days ago, dedicated as the Charles M. Vest Student Street, named after our sadly very recently deceased former president. It is a space where there are a series of classrooms off of that student street, but the street has places for students to congregate, easy access obviously to Wi-Fi. It has a Starbucks, it has a cafeteria, it has a gym. It's a place where you stay, you stick, you interact, you discuss. We very cleverly put the parking garage for the faculty below it. So as they come to work, they have to flow through that space, and they stick, because students stop and talk to them. And it really is a place to rethink. It's not the only way to do it, but to rethink, how do you think about a learning space in a more structured kind of way? Second big thing we're looking at is to think about, how do you encourage hands-on learning? And here what MIT is very strongly debating is, how do we think about spaces in which students can try hands-on things, both in a class setting, but especially outside of a class setting. Maker spaces, or the term I like, are sandboxes. Create spaces where students can gather to work on a project. And I call it a sandbox because it should not only be a place to play, but there should be toys. MIT will provide 3D printers, lathes, numerical control machines, access to the cloud, access to CAD tools. Let the students play. Let people flow through there and interact with them. And then let's see what interesting comes out of it. And by the way, our policy, which you don't have to follow, is anything that an undergraduate creates in that space, even though they're using our toys, belongs to the student. Then finally, impact on finances. And I will acknowledge to you here that this is a tough one. John Hennessy and Nick Dirks made some nice comments yesterday about where we are on this. I think it will be different for each institution, and I would remind you that I think all of us, our goal is to make education more efficient and more effective. But it does create some opportunities to change the finances. You could allow a student to finish in shorter time. You could allow the student to gain more knowledge, if you like, with that freed up time. You can make it more flexible. Student could take a break, do an internship in service, or start a company and then come back. One of the things I want to point out as interesting is, and I want to be careful as I say, MIT initially debated very strongly the idea that we might be able to reduce the on-campus time from 4 years to 3. Say to all of our admitted freshmen, you're going to do the first year at home using online courses. Saves your parents a quarter of the tuition, lets us flow a third as many students through the campus. What was interesting about it is, in the dialogue leading up to that report, students hated the idea. Their parents may not agree with them, but students hated that idea because they said, we want to be on campus, we want to be building those communities. And so we have to think about, how do we balance that? Because maybe what is financially good for us may not be what the students actually want. There are, of course, other opportunities, and I'm just going to do these quickly. You heard them. You can think about how to use it for continuing education, executive education offerings. And many of the companies that are offering these tools are certainly thinking about them. Grant certificates for topical themes to alumni. It's a great way to keep your alumni engaged. There are a set of ways, as John Hennessy said, to cover the costs of doing the online tools. But I think this is still very much an open question. Other ways you've seen talked about this, but let me just close with, there can be some surprising ways in which you might be able to do this. And I'm sorry I borrowed this one from you, but I can't resist it. There can be some unexpected benefits. And this was a comment from a student who took a nonce course, the first 6002X. It says, MITx may have saved our marriage. This is, the context is, it was a mother, stay-at-home mother, who had a bachelor's degree, but not in engineering, if I remember right, Anant, married to a gentleman who did have a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, and they were taking the course together. And this was her comment. What was fun about it is their daughter is a student at MIT, and there's her response. So if you're worried about finances, you can run a dating service or a matchmaking service or something on the side, and you'll make a little extra money off of all of this, which is a very poor joking way of saying we don't know yet where the finances are going to be, but we're all worrying about it. So I think we're all here to think about what are the changes, and what I've tried to do is give you a sense of how my institution, and I suspect many of yours, are thinking about how do we change our curriculum, our pedagogy, our spaces, in basically every aspect of how we do online education. With that, I'd be happy to take a few questions. While you're thinking about questions, yes, my jokes are this bad, and I tell students, I'm tenured, you cannot do a thing about it, so.
Thanks. My name is Trey Surden. I'm a research analyst at Wells Fargo. Thank you. It was an incredibly thoughtful presentation. What I would love to hear from you is the discussions that you've had at MIT, or how you think about the role that your institution plays as a leader, as an elite institution, in helping to sort of shape some of these questions that you've addressed for your own institution more broadly, and specifically to, the kinds of institutions that serve students that aren't going to MIT, that are going to sort of a broader swath of colleges?
It's a great question, and I'm going to get myself in deep political trouble here. MIT is in a very fortunate position. I hate the word elite, but I understand the kind of institution we are. I think we also believe that we have an obligation because of that, and so I would point you to 3 factors. We launched OpenCourseWare almost 12 years ago. It turned out to be a bigger thing than we thought it was, but with the notion that we had an opportunity to provide things to anybody in the world that wanted to use our teaching material. And I want to say this very carefully, because I know there are folks from Coursera and Udacity here, and they are great organizations. But one of the reasons MIT launched MITx was because our then provost, now president, Raphael Reif, and many of the rest of us very strongly believed that there needed to be a not-for-profit alternative in this space. Sorry, you don't need to do that. And again, Coursera, Udacity, the other thing, they are also great alternatives, but we thought it was important to do that. We'll see how we play out. We're doing okay so far. The third piece of it is that, of 4, and I'm almost done, is the reason we made our report public is because we wanted to share with people how we're thinking about it. We don't expect our thoughts are going to match to everybody. There's going to be some things unique to MIT, but we did want to let people see, here are the things that we're debating, and we will put the final report out as well for anybody that wants to look at it to try and match it in. And I hate to do this, but if you're really interested and you want to come and talk, send me a note. If I can't do it, I will hook you up with somebody else who can deal with it. But the fourth piece deals with the question of not every place is like MIT, and that's certainly true. I mean, we are heavily a science and engineering institution. Not every place is going to deal that way. Not every place has the same set of students. Through our partners at edX, we are engaged in discussion with other institutions around how can we hear what you need and how can we use that to try and think about how you can build on it. I'll give you one quick example. I want to be fair, it was edX that did this, but the course, the MOOC I taught, 600, edX did an experiment, and I think there's a nice message in it in which that course was offered at 2 community colleges, 2, and not right in the Boston area. It's a course aimed for MIT freshmen. It's not going to match necessarily well to the community college, but one of the things through edX that we were able to do is work with the instructors at the community college to figure out how can we take that material and put it in a context that matches the backgrounds of our learners. I'll give you a very quick example. One of the one of the problems I ask students to do if you're a computer scientist is I ask them to write a program that takes a derivative of a function. So you give it a program, you give it a function that computes something mathematically. It's supposed to give you back another function that takes the derivative. As the instructor said, my community college kids have no idea what a derivative is, and I don't want to spend the time to do it. So we figured out how to take the same idea, which is about higher order objects, and turn it into a problem that the community college could work. Long answer that says we are happy to, as much as we have the time, to try and work to think about what is it that we're doing that might help. But I think the biggest thing is we will make our report open. We'll take some slings and arrows for it, but we'll let people look at it and see what they can learn from it to see if it matches. With the lights on, I can't see if there are other questions here. Yep, there is.
I'll ask one. Is this working? Justin Reich from HarvardX. First, this is a little tangential, but I think the descriptions that you have of maker spaces and community spaces on campus are really beautiful, and really appreciated hearing that. I was talking with a faculty member on MIT's campus, and here's how they described the change from MIT. Their experience with MITx is that we had these lectures, and the lectures went on MITx, and so then we started using the lecture time on campus as recitation. And now we also have these recitations and we don't know what to do with them. Like how are we going to keep our TAs busy now? We haven't sort of figured that out. So one thing about that story, you could argue that it's a pretty it's a pretty conservative story of sort of taking the same kinds of pieces and time shifting them a little bit, and taking advantage of some flexibility and some advantages there. How are you thinking about sort of the changes within those pieces? How are you thinking about saying, how are we going to support faculty in not just recording what they're doing now, but really looking at what they're doing now? How are we going to say to faculty, like, all right, so you have more time with recitation, you have this whole other hour period that you can use for whatever you want. How do you think about, across departments, across the university, providing faculty support so that it's not just moving the places where things happen, but really changing and improving what teaching and learning looks like in each of those spaces?
Great question. First part of the answer is yes, there will be faculty who will not shift. It's okay. I actually hate it when somebody thinks that online means put a video camera at the back of my lecture hall and capture me, because, what's the point? To really answer your question, though, what we're trying to do is encourage faculty, and by the way, the encouragement includes working with departments to free up time by providing resources so faculty can spend the time, but to ask them to think about what are the experiences that you really want to have with your students that are direct and face-to-face? And what are the things that you really could think of as, if it was a great textbook, that's what I want in it, but now it's live, now it's interactive. Let me give you a quick example. I've talked to faculty in electrical engineering that are superb circuit designers. And I've seen these guys do it. One of the most beautiful things to watch is a really good circuit designer doing circuit design. Because they're not starting, most of them, with formulas and equations and working it through. They've got a whole set of tools and tricks that they use. And so in talking with him, I said, look, you can put the discussion of that in a lecture, but what you want to do is let the students interact with you and watch you do a circuit design. And that's what you'd like to do in that online setting. So the point is asking faculty to think about, so what would I want to really have a conversation with the students about? And how do we make that happen in a face-to-face way? And then what are the pieces that could more naturally move into other directions? But I hear your comment / complaint, which is you're right. If we're just shifting the time, we're not accomplishing anything. And frankly, to be blunt, if all we do is have faculty think that this just gives them more time to be in the research lab, we've really failed. When we're hoping that won't happen.
One more question. I'm still stuck on the fruit flies. At some point, 2 generations from now, there will be a video about the simulation of the fruit flies and nobody will be around to remember how the experiment actually went. But when people discovered genetics, they were touching these things. So where will we do our discoveries if we move everything online?
A great question, and I'll tell you the perspective from MIT, which is one of the things we would like to have is rephrase it. We have a wonderful program in my mind called UROP, Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program, where students work as partners in research labs doing real-world experiences. One of the advantages we think is that we can expand the UROP experience. Your question is great because you're right. It cannot be purely virtual, and there will be some fields where I think you really still have to do the live experiment, if you like. But I'd like to see a lot of the opportunities shift for the real-world experience or the practical experience into settings where the students can be exploring things of interest to them rather than the experiment that everybody had to do because Mendel did it and therefore we've got to do it. Sorry, nothing wrong with that experiment. It's a great experiment, but put it in that kind of setting. Having said that, my own perspective, this purely personal perspective, is there are some disciplines where I'm really not certain how much you can do online. Chemistry. Solid state chemistry, yes, and we in fact did that very nicely, but more traditional chemistry, some parts of biology, some parts of humanities, I'm guessing are going to be much harder to do. If I may, if I got 30 seconds left, John, let me give you the one other example of, because the solid state chemistry reminded me, so it's a switch, but of where we see real excitement about the online tools. And this to me is very much a demonstration of how the immediate feedback to a student is a tremendous asset that comes. There's a required course at MIT called 3091, Introduction to Solid State Chemistry. It's been offered as an online course. It was offered last term on campus. Because it's a required course at MIT, we have something called the 5th week flag. It's mostly aimed at freshmen. At the end of the 5th week of the term, instructors identify any student in the class they worry is in danger of failing, and they flag them to their advisor and to the students to get them help with mentoring and interactions and things like that. Typically in this class of about 450, there would be 40 to 60 5th week flags in the fall term, so call it 50. Last term, the teaching was, lectures were live, although you didn't have to come. All of the assessments were online with the immediate feedback. Students could do them multiple times. They could retry them. If they took a quiz and they didn't succeed, they could come back and take a different version of the quiz a couple of days later. Normally 50 fifth-week flags. Last term, 3. It's one data point. I know we can draw a line through anything with one data point, but I get really intrigued by thinking about, boy, there's some impact that I think could really change things. Hopefully we'll see more of those stories.